Alright, this is block 6, note number 6, the Second Great Awakening and the Great Reform Movements. And I think I'm going to need some kind of introductory music for these. So if anyone's really technically competent and can put together a little introductory solo lecture music, come find me. Alright, the Second Great Awakening. When you read your Paul Johnson, the First Great Awakening was called by Johnson the precursor to the American Revolution. That the American Revolution and the American split from Great Britain could never have happened without the First Great Awakening and its emphasis on a reduction in the power of authority and Americans kind of getting together and knowing each other a little bit better and creating a national culture. The Second Great Awakening had just as monumental consequences, and it is no stretch to say that it was the Second Great Awakening that began the movement to finally abolish slavery in the United States. That without the Second Great Awakening, the abolition of slavery would have taken on a much different route. So let's talk about this Second Great Awakening. It starts around the year 1820. And lasts for about 15 or 20 years before it peters out, but its consequences lasted much, much longer. And it is a reaction to the fact that in the late 18th century, the 1780s and 1790s and early 1800s, religion had become very stale again. It was the age of reason and deism, and people were missing the emotional and spiritual quality that religion very often brings. The Second Great Awakening saw the final assaults on traditional Calvinism. Traditional Puritanism finally got beaten away and destroyed by this Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening comes out against infant damnation, which the Puritans believed. And it stops talking so much about God's immense power. And it's during the Second Great Awakening that people really begin to talk about God's immense love and compassion for His creation. The Second Great Awakening is also an attack on deism. And deism is a very important concept in American religious history. It was the religion of most of the founders. Ben Franklin, George Washington are very commonly referred to as deists. Thomas Jefferson, when he was not disbelieving in God entirely, was certainly a deist. And a deist is a person who believes in what's known as the watchmaker God. And the metaphor is God as the watchmaker, that like a watchmaker creates this complex creation, the watch, and then sets it in motion, and then the watch works without the influence of the watchmaker, that we don't need a watchmaker every time the watch, we need the watch to work. And deists believe that God operated in the same way. That God set up the universe in all of its beautiful complexity and all of its amazing detail, and then just kind of sent it on its way, and did not play a role in history. That the watchmaker God created His universe, created His creation, and sent it on its merry way. Deists believe that God does not involve Himself in human history, that He is a distant and far away God. During the Second Great Awakening, people begin to preach again that God cares very deeply about His creation, and God cares very deeply about the individual fates of individual people. And they begin preaching again that salvation is available to everyone, that everyone can be saved, that everyone can go to heaven. And not only that, but predestination is completely out. The Second Great Awakening folks preach that every person can have a hand, can have a role in their own salvation. And not only can they have a role in their own salvation, but they can have a role in the salvation of others as well. And it was not just backwoods preachers who believed this, that the president of Yale was involved, for example, in the Second Great Awakening. Lyman Beecher, a very important Second Great Awakening preacher, and he is more famous because of his daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who will one day write Uncle Tom's Cabin, a great piece of propaganda, if you will, against the institution of slavery. Like the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening was based around these giant camp meetings. Itinerant and traveling preachers would come through an area, and everybody and their mother-in-law would show up at these great giant camp meetings. There's one here on the screen where the preacher would stand up on stage and whip everybody up into this religious frenzy with singing and dancing and shouting and chanting. And one by one, when you felt the power of God upon you, you would approach the preacher, you would approach the stage and declare yourself to be saved. This became known as evangelicalism or revivalism. The idea that to be saved, you had to feel the power of God on you. And as soon as you declared yourself to be saved, you would be saved. As long as you accepted, Jesus in your life. Evangelicalism is still a very powerful force in America today. The belief of the Second Great Awakening is that religion and the fate of your soul are in your hands. And God was watching you, hoping that you would choose to be saved. It was not as if God did not care. God, according to the Second Great Awakening people, God watched you and wanted you to accept His grace and to accept His forgiveness and to accept His authority over your moral life. Since women are the center of the religious upbringing of children, the Second Great Awakening is run and funded and led very largely by women, and middle-class women mostly. And like the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening was also active all over the country, but it was strongest in western New York and in the Old Northwest. Indiana, Ohio, parts of western Pennsylvania, Illinois, places like that. And in and of itself, the Second Great Awakening was important in the sense that it touched the lives of millions of individual peoples who gained great comfort from it. But in the study of history, the Second Great Awakening was more important because of the reform movements, because of the results and consequences that it spread. Before we get to the reform movements, there's some other results and consequences. And the first is this very, very uniquely American not circumstance, but a very uniquely American thing to do in a way. A very uniquely American religious thing to do. And the Second Great Awakening, what it did was it spawned dozens of utopian experiments. Now, a utopia is an English word. It's from the Greek. It means no place. That a utopia, traditionally understood, is a place that is so perfect that it cannot possibly exist in this world. But some of the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening was channeled into creating these utopian communities, and there was dozens of them all over the United States. The idea was that if you were going to create the world anew, that the idea that we can create the world fresh is a powerful idea. And this belief in progress and this belief in middle-class mobility, and added to that this Second Great Awakening that God loves you and wants you to be saved and wants you to be the best you can be, led people to want to try to create these perfect societies here on Earth. And true believers said, well, let's try out our beliefs before we actually try to get everyone to do them. And so they became communitarians. The idea being that if you want to totally change society, you have to start small. Start with the true believers in that change, and then people will follow you from that. And one of the most important of these utopian societies were the Shakers. The Shakers were founded by an English woman in America named Anne Lee, and they were called the Shakers because their religious dances were so fervent and so full of ecstasy that their critics mocked them as just shaking. And of course, they took that name and they gave it to themselves and were very happy with it. Ann Lee died in 1784, but these Shaker villages, the first one was up near Albany, New York, these Shaker villages grew, and before long there was 20 of them. And they had some practices that would really that make us kind of look at them a little strange these days. First of all, they practiced complete sexual segregation. Men and women lived in different parts of the community. They never touched each other. They were completely celibate. No sex in Shaker villages. They did not believe in children. The Shakers believed that the second coming of Christ and the end of the world was right around the corner, so there was no purpose in having children. Obviously, this does not allow the Shakers to really increase their numbers very much, and they only ever increase their numbers through people coming and joining their community. But there was a strict sense of complete equality between the sexes. Men and women did the same sorts of work. They engaged in the same types of activities. Their religious practice was joyful with the singing and the dancing, and they were industrious and skilled and lived very simply, and they were greatly admired, even though a lot of people back in the day thought that they were a little strange. And people admired their devotion to what they believed in. They admired their economic ability. And you can still go visit many Shaker villages today and see the crafts that are made. Other communities were the Amana, the Oneida, up in New York. They were the opposite of the Shakers in the sense that the Oneida practiced complex marriage, which pretty much meant everybody slept with everybody. Which, I guess if that's your bag, worked out pretty well for them. Most important to the long-term future of America in this new religion, we're not out of the utopia. The utopias survived for a long time, many decades in places, but eventually the fervor behind the utopias died out. And what was left was a very interesting little piece of American cultural history. Making a much larger impact on American cultural history was a young man from upstate New York named Joseph Smith. And here we have a beautiful, idealized portrait of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was from Vermont, not New York, I'm sorry. Joseph Smith was a Vermont farm boy who founded the world's newest branch of Christianity. The story is very interesting. If you are interested in the story of Joseph Smith, there are many people who will tell it to you. But to make a long story short, Joseph Smith claimed that he was a prophet and could communicate directly with God, and got a whole lot of believers and supporters to follow him. His supporters were dedicated and economically very efficient, and their numbers and their wealth grew. Their unusual beliefs, the fact that somebody in the 1830s was claiming that he was a prophet in the first place, and other beliefs that they held, including the fact that they were God's new chosen people, turned a lot of people off from Joseph Smith and his followers, who started calling themselves the Mormons. And a lot of people started to dislike the Mormons. They were forced out of New England, and they settled in Illinois and founded a town called Nauvoo. Joseph Smith authorized polygamy, or multiple wives for one man shortly thereafter, and the persecution grew even greater. In 1847, a local mob lynched Joseph Smith and killed him. A rumor had been spread that he was trying to take over the old Northwest and rule it by himself. He was succeeded by another Mormon by the name of Brigham Young. He took the community and said, "We're leaving American society in its entirety." And Brigham Young took this community across the continent, across mountains and deserts, to what is today Utah. Back then was a completely unorganized, wild territory. Nobody really lived there. And near in what is today Salt Lake City, Brigham Young put his community down, built incredibly strong roots. The communal living of the Mormons eventually died out, but the Mormon Church remained. It named itself the Church of Latter-day Saints. It played a vital role in shaping the West right through the 20th and now into the 21st century. And right now, in the year 2012, Mormonism, founded by Joseph Smith during the Second Great Awakening, is America's fastest growing religion. That does it for the Great Awakening's religious consequences. Its social consequences were much more significant and much longer lasting. The Great Awakening's children can truly be called the reform movements of the middle 19th century. And there were the belief that society could be perfected and that you could influence your own salvation and that you could influence the salvation of others led people to try to reform and improve the country that they lived in. And there were reform movements for virtually everything. The disabled, for the first time in human history, had people beyond close family members caring for them. Thomas Gallaudet, that's French. Thomas Gallaudet developed methods for educating the deaf. Dr. Samuel Gridley, years before Louis Braille, developed a way for the blind to read. Dr. Howe was interested in teaching the mentally disabled. The big push in the 19th century was to take disabled people, people who were blind or deaf or mentally retarded, and remove them from the care of their families, who had many other things to worry about, and put them into institutions that would help them deal with their problems. And they could be around people who were like them, and they could be around people who were experts in how to deal with them. So today we associate institutions with a negative connotation, that you don't want to be institutionalized, that we would never today think of taking all the deaf people and putting them just in one giant building. But in the 1830s and 40s, that was considered to be the height of humane treatment, because they would be taken care of by scientific experts who knew what they were doing and would supervise them effectively, and would be taken out of the care of their families, who were too busy to worry about them too much. Unfortunately, the realities of the world often got in the way of these glorious ideas for these institutions, and the institutions in the 19th century were very often awful, for lack of a better term, that they were underfunded, understaffed. The people did not know what caused, mental disease, for instance, did not know how to treat it, and these institutions honestly became hellholes on earth. And it was not a place that anyone would want to go visit, work in, or, God forbid, be put into if you were blind or deaf or mentally disabled or mentally retarded or mentally ill. It was a hard life and a terrible one. Another reform movement centered around prisons. During colonial times, punishment for crimes usually involved public humiliation and small fines, and for serious crimes, execution. Jails were expensive. Jails cost a lot of money. Jails prevented you from being productive in society. Fines were not large because nobody had a lot of money. They would publicly humiliate you and send you on your way out of town. And for serious offenses, horse theft, murder, you got executed. You had a quick trial and no appeals process, and then you swung. You hanged. But during the Second Great Awakening, something is going to happen called the Penitentiary Movement. And if you look at the word penitentiary, the root is penitence. To be penitent, or to do penance, means to ask for forgiveness. Repent. Say you're sorry and mean it for what you've done. A penitentiary is a place for that. It is a place where one would do penance and find God. That the founders of this prison reform movement, which found its greatest example at a place in Philadelphia called Eastern State Penitentiary, which is honestly you can go visit it. It is one of the coolest places I've ever been. Let's see if we can zoom in on this bad boy. Okay, here we go. Ready? There it is. Eastern State Penitentiary. The people who founded the Eastern State Penitentiary were religiously inspired people. Remember that. And they believed that all a person needed to be good in the world was to... It's like, you know what it's like? It was like your parents when you were little, when you did something, they said, go up into your room and think about it for a little while. Well, the whole prison reform movement, the penitentiary movement, was based around that idea. That you would go to prison, be alone, and think about it for a little while. That Eastern State Penitentiary provided for a cell where you never saw or interacted with another human being. You had... it was well apportioned. It was better apportioned than many living quarters. There was indoor plumbing and heating, and there was a little inside section and then a little outside section, so you could have some fresh air and see the sun. But no, you would never speak or see another human being. And the idea is you're supposed to think about it for a little while and repent, and God would forgive you. The other advantage is the anonymity of being in prison. Once you got out, no one would know that you were in prison because no one ever saw you there. You would not be walking down the street and someone would yell, "Hey, Joe! We were in a can together. We were in a clink together." That it was anonymous. And the idea was that once you got out, you would start a new life. There was reform already in the institutions. A woman by the name of Dorothea Dix was as close to a saint as you'll get on this planet. Traveled around the world, literally, trying to influence for the better these institutions where they put the mentally disabled and the mentally ill and orphans and the insane and the deaf and the blind. And by herself, with her, you know, led by herself with her supporters, she worked to improve the situations for these people in these unfortunate places. But despite the good work that Mrs. Dix did, most of the institutions remained places where no one would really want to be in the world. One of the more popular movements, especially among women, was the Temperance Movement. And to understand we can understand the Temperance Movement because you've lived your entire lives in the Just Say No to Drugs movement. And that temperance was just that, but for alcohol. And nowhere were women more important than with the exception of women's rights, but nowhere were women more important than in the temperance movement, the movement to ban alcohol. Drinking was much more prevalent in those days. Drinking took place at work all the time, that laborers and factory workers, as a part of their contract, got a certain amount of alcohol every day. Many men, upon getting paid at work, on their way home, spent all their money at the local saloon, came home to wife and kids, and oops, I don't have any money, and then would very often beat the crap out of their wives when their wives called them on it. Since women were the leaders of the home, this cult of true womanhood that we've talked about, women took it upon themselves to end the practice of drinking in America. And they founded the American Temperance Movement in the year 1826. They campaigned against drunkenness, first arguing for restraint, don't drink so much, and then they began arguing for the outright banning of alcohol. Well, they didn't get that, but by 1855, the temperance movement had had a lot of successes. Alcohol could only be sold by a licensed establishment, and that's true to this day. Not just any restaurant can sell alcohol. They need a liquor license. So that restricted the amount of places that a person could get alcohol. Most factories banned drinking on the job, which makes sense, because if you're operating big, heavy, important, expensive machinery, you really don't want to be drunk. Alcohol was heavily taxed. Very few reform movements have had the success that the temperance movement had. That by the difference in the amount of drinking between 1820 and 1855, by 1855, the average American drank half the alcohol that he had drunk back a generation earlier. And that is quite a big success. That families were a lot better off, men were a lot better off, women were a lot better off, and children were a lot better off. It was truly a movement that found success, and it was success for a good cause. The women's rights movement in the United States starts during the Second Great Awakening. And the women's rights movement starts as a appendage of the abolitionist movement, the movement to ban slavery. Many women in the North were abolitionists, and as they started arguing against slavery and the chains that held blacks in bondage in the American South, they soon came to realize that the metaphorical but no less non-existent chains that held them back in society were in many cases just as strong as the chains that held blacks in servitude in the South. And in some ways, metaphorical ways, the chains that held women back were worse because slaves were not expected to like being slaves, but women were expected to like the roles that women were supposed to do. And as more and more women became abolitionists, more and more women started saying, hey, we're second-class citizens also. And the feminist movement was born. What early feminists wanted was equal civil rights. In the United States of the 1830s and 1840s, single women, women who were not married, spinsters, as they would have called them back then, unmarried women had basic civil rights. Married women, however, did not. Married women in most states could not own property. Their property was held by their husband. They could not make a will. They did not have access to the professional world of doctoring and lawyering. And of course, they did not have the right to vote. And it was those civil rights that early feminists and early women's rights activists began arguing for. And some of them are worth mentioning by name. You had the Grimke Sisters. These were two incredibly brave women. Why? They were from South Carolina, and they were fervently anti-slavery, which angered enough people, I'm sure, in their hometown. And then they went and took that a step further, and they moved from anti-slavery to pro-women's rights. This did not endear them to most of the people in South Carolina. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is one of the more famous early, let's set a picture of her young. The youth usually does people a little more justice. There's Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was the first person. I'm going to move this back a little bit here. That's better. She was the first person to really recognize and write about the disconnect that faces many women today. How can a woman, Miss Stanton said, how can a woman balance her desire for a professional life, a wider life in a wider community, with her desire to have a family? And it's a very difficult question. It's a question that women have been, dealing with for a very long time, especially today. And she was the first person to really kind of raise that issue. Lucretia Mott was another early feminist women's rights advocate. And they got together at a place called Seneca Falls in upstate New York. And they organized a convention in 1848, and at this convention, they drafted what they called a Declaration of Sentiments, and it is actively and specifically modeled after Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And it starts with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men and women are created equal." And it goes on to argue why and what they wanted. It was in the exact format of the Declaration of Independence. There was lots of conventions afterwards, and many attempts followed. But at this point in American history, there was very few successes. That by 1850, most of the reforming spirit in the country had turned in one direction, and one direction only. And these women, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, would have to wait another 30 or 40 years before their movement picked up steam again. Because by 1850, all of the reforming spirit in America was now focused on one issue, and one issue alone. And that issue was the ending of the sin of slavery. And that was the issue which falls under the heading abolitionism. Abolitionism and the movement to abolish slavery is one of the great successes and one of the great moral triumphs of American history. That an institution that had been in every culture and every time period for all of human history was extirpated from the face of the country due to, in the end, due to extreme pressure from people who recognized its evil and worked to end it. It's obvious, or it should be obvious, just why slavery fell under the eyes of the reformers. It violated every instinct that these reformers, inspired by the Second Great Awakening, had. Humanitarians were outraged by the whip and the beatings and the splitting of family. People who believed in political equality and democracy were insulted that slaves had no political or civil rights. People who believed that all people could improve themselves through education were angry that slaves could not educate themselves. And most importantly, with this Second Great Awakening, people could not juxtapose the idea that all people were created equal in God's eyes with the institution of slavery. And this is the most powerful arrow in the abolitionist quiver. If God created all men equally with a soul, then how could one man hold another man in bondage? They are fighting against an incredibly powerful force. First of all, the South is one of the most, it has a very wealthy, slave-based, cotton-based economy. The economic power of the South resists slavery. And since the economic power of the North is in many ways benefits from slavery, they resist it too. Anyone who's making textiles in the North and selling textiles in the North is making money off the backs of slavery, even if they don't own slaves themselves. So there is a powerful financial and economic interest against the ending of slavery. Two is the primacy, the importance of property in American law. In general, a very good thing. We want property to be protected. But in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, slaves were considered property, and therefore they had the slave owners had the law on their side. The law of property said that slaves were property and the government could not take them. And third, the Constitution does not say that the federal government has anything to do with slavery. That slavery, with the exception of the Three-Fifths Compromise and the abolition of the slave trade, slavery is out of the Constitution. And Southerners interpreted that to mean that the federal government had no business sticking its furry little snout into internal state matters. That's what they're up against. And that's quite an array of forces. The attitude of most anti-slavery people in the early 19th century. What did they think about slavery at the time? Well, first of all, they believed that it was evil. There's nothing new there. They also agreed that it was legal in the South. And only the most radical argued for its abolition where it was, because to argue for its abolition where it was seemed to most to advocate revolution and violence and extremism. So most abolitionists did not argue for immediate and complete emancipation of all slaves. Many anti-slavery people supported the idea of colonization, that the slaves should be bought by the United States government and sent off to Africa, back to Africa, where they could live with American support. The American Colonization Society was set up, and in fact, land in West Africa was bought. It became the Republic of Liberia. Its capital was named Monrovia, after President James Monroe, and many, many influential people argued that the slaves should all move back to Africa. Some went. Most did not. Most did not want to, even if they had the opportunity. For better or worse, the United States was their home. They spoke English, they were Christians, and whether Africa was strange and distant and foreign and they knew nothing about it, the majority of them, the vast majority of them. So they were sticking around, that the slaves were going to stay in the United States, and the United States, white America, would not be able to so easily get rid of its problem by shipping it back across the ocean. Only a few thousand ever went. But Liberia is still there. Its flag is modeled after the American flag. Its capital is Monrovia. And the former slaves that did go there formed the elite of Liberian society for a very long time. It's an interesting country with a very interesting history. A person who believed in abolition was called an abolitionist. And their leaders ran the gamut from people who did not want to see slavery spread to men like William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison thought, he was from Massachusetts, a Puritan in thought and deed and manner. William Lloyd Garrison thought that all the excuse-making about why slavery could not be ended now was just that, excuses. He argued for full and complete and immediate emancipation, and the slaves would not be sent back to Africa, but would be given equal citizenship in the United States. He founded a newspaper called The Liberator, in which he expounded his views. And he did not like the United States government or United States society one bit. He felt that the entire government was just as guilty as the slave owners. He thought because they were just as guilty, he was not going to have anything to do with politics, because involving himself in the politics of the United States meant that he was involving himself in this sin and this crime of slavery. To us, he sounds eminently reasonable. In the 1830s, he was not found to be eminently reasonable. And in the 1830s, he was often beaten, silenced by other anti-slavery forces. That it was not pro-slavery people that were beating him up and shutting him up. It was other anti-slavery people who said to him, look, you're not doing anything to help us out with this extreme rhetoric. But he kept writing and he kept publishing, and slowly his constant attacks on the institutions, on the institution of slavery, turned people's mind. A political party, the Liberty Party, grew up in an attempt to slowly emancipate the slaves. Ran for president, got nowhere. And what they argued for was an end to slavery through legislative means, a slow and gradual emancipation of the slaves. We're going to talk about that Liberty Party in Block 7. It plays a role in an important presidential election. Most abolitionists were white, because most of the people in the North were white. There are relatively few free blacks in the North, but most free blacks in the North were involved in the abolitionist crusade from the beginning. Before the Second Great Awakening, there are over 50 black abolitionist groups throughout the North. They tended to agree with Garrison that slavery should be ended immediately and with full equality afterwards, more than the slower-moving people like the Liberty Party. Sadly, but not unexpectedly, they were often sought out as props for white anti-slavery speakers, to be used as tokens, But the motivation of these white speakers was good. What they were trying to do in getting black abolitionist speakers to speak was to prove that a black man was the intellectual and rhetorical and oratorical equal of any whites. And just the fact that many blacks stood up and eloquently argued against slavery convinced many whites that black people were, in fact and indeed, the equal of whites. So it was a good thing, because there were so few blacks in the North that you could go a long time without really getting to know or listen to any people who were not white, if you were a white person living in the North. There was an abolitionist by the name of David Walker. He's known as the father of black nationalism, the idea that black people ought to be separate and apart and free and independent and on their own. He had been born free but had experienced the slavery of the South and the racism of the North. And he did not believe that the United States could ever solve its racial problem. And he did not believe that white America could ever be just or fair to black citizens. So he became a black nationalist and did not work for compromise or anything like that. Finally, we must talk about probably the most famous of all the abolitionists, Frederick Douglass. And there's a famous portrait of him. Frederick Douglass. There he is. Oops. Frederick Douglass. Gotta figure out a better way to do that. Frederick Douglass had been born a slave in the state of Maryland. He suffered the typical beatings and other indignities, but what made Douglass different was that Douglass learned how to read and write, and he learned a trade. He had a master that allowed him to learn these things. And as soon as he was able, he ran away and escaped to the North. And while in the North, and when in the North, Frederick Douglass put his incredible God-given talent to the cause of showing white America their hypocrisy. And, more importantly than showing them their hypocrisy, Frederick Douglass showed white America how they could overcome that hypocrisy. He became a popular speaker on the abolitionist circuit and declared very powerfully that slavery, he said, brands your republicanism a sham, your humanity a base pretense, and your Christianity a lie. And that's a powerful statement. He said that slavery makes free government a joke, your humanity a lie, and your religion false. And if you want free government, godly religion, and to be human, you could do nothing but oppose slavery. He published his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which is one of the greatest accounts of the life of a slave that we have. He insisted that emancipation, the ending of slavery for blacks, was just the beginning of freedom. That freedom is not just a lack of slavery, Douglass argued, but that freedom meant full political and civil equality. And his words were not popular, even among abolitionists at first. But such was the power of his message, and the power of his speaking, and the power of his voice, and the power of his moral authority, that many people began to come around. It was also completely impossible to listen to the man and believe that black people were inferior. The man was a better speaker and more brilliant than the vast majority of anybody on this planet. You could not watch or listen to Frederick Douglass and come away and say, black people deserve to be slaves. And that played a huge role in his success. Douglass first agreed with Garrison that compromise was not possible when it came to slavery, and compromise should not be sought. That, like Garrison, Douglass started out as a moral absolutist. It was either 100% abolition or nothing. But he soon realized that in the real world, sometimes you had to compromise. And he began to feel that persuasion of white America and the use of the Constitution, with its words about tranquility and liberty, added to the powerful call of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Douglass believed that you could take the founding documents of American history and easily use them to argue against slavery. And since all Americans revered the Constitution and revered the Declaration, linking the cause of abolition to America's founding documents was a winning political formula. And he gave speech after speech saying how if Americans wanted to fulfill the promise of Jefferson's words, then slavery must end. Garrison fought slavery from outside the system. Douglass fought it from inside the system. And because he fought it from inside the system, he grew more respected among these middle-class Americans that made up these reform movements. By 1850, the abolitionists have won in the all-important realm of public opinion. Most Northerners in 1850 are anti-slavery. They are not necessarily pro-equality, but they are definitely anti-slavery. It is becoming less extreme to argue for full emancipation. It is becoming less extreme to argue for full political and civil rights for blacks. It is completely mainstream to argue that slavery should not, cannot be allowed to spread beyond where it already is right now. That became the norm in the North. In the South, the fact that what had been extreme was now normal freaked out Southerners. They thought that Northern opinion was hardening in an extreme way, and therefore Southern opinion began to harden and become more extreme as well. Instead of defending slavery as a peculiar institution that in time would go away, Southerners began defending slavery as a positive good because black people were not equal, black people deserved to be slaves, black people were better off as slaves, and before long, the sections, the North and the South, stopped being able to listen to each other, and stopped being able to hear each other, and stopped being able to communicate with each other. And that thin glue, the glue of the Constitution that held the North and the South together, because the two sides were growing further and further apart, that glue was growing weaker and weaker and weaker. And by 1860, the two sections are ready to completely split apart and go their separate ways. The Second Great Awakening led to the end of slavery, just like the First Great Awakening led to the end of British domination over the colonies. These religious movements created political reforms that reverberate to this very day. Thank you. Now I need some music for the end.